Hey everyone, welcome to the episode. So Ask Aram flips the script. One Step Beyond podcast guests and listeners submit their questions and ask Aram anything. Questions can be music, life stories, business, leadership, advice, how to make the best vegan omelet, you name it. Aram will unpack your questions and leave you with info you can apply. Before we get to it, please rate, review, and subscribe. It doesn't matter how much preparation I've done for meetings. When I'm called on, my mind goes blank. I know the material, but when it's time to deliver, nothing is there. What can I do to stop this from happening?
Sympathetic nervous system response and exposure therapy. So what I mean by that is you're totally right. Prep. You're going to totally prep. You've got all your notes written. You've done all this stuff. And boom, you go into the meeting, you totally blank. The way I look at the sympathetic nervous system, so our fight or flight, it's like a glass wall that descends from the ceiling. And so that glass wall is always just a little bit poking out from the ceiling. And that's because the sympathetic nervous system, which again, it's like fight or flight, and then parasympathetic nervous system, which are state of calm and relaxation, they're always in like a constant negotiation, and one is never fully on and the other's ever fully off. So if that sympathetic nervous system, if you're at your most calm, that little glass wall is still sticking out from the ceiling. In front of you is a toolbox, and on that toolbox is two levels. The top level are your most basic skills, which are still super good. Basic skills would be ability to answer general questions, ability to ask general questions, your ability to track what someone is saying, basic use of your physical and verbal presence, ability to access quickly your short-term memory. The deeper level of that toolbox would be access to long-term memory and creative thought, your ability to negotiate, empathy, answering more complex questions, your ability to use physical and verbal presence to tone set and really like set the tone of the room. All that kind of stuff would be lower level. If you're someone who gets lit up by having a speaking engagement, the way you should look at it is that glass wall starts coming down and it gets in between you and your tools. So there's three stages of this from the way I look at it. The first stage is the glass wall comes down a quarter of the way. And so that quarter of the way, it is not in between you and the toolbox at all. That is what most people's performance state is. And it could be presenting, it could be going to play like a show, it could be doing a marathon, it could be like whatever it is. It's that space where you're like, okay, I have to go and do something and I want to do well at it. Even if it's something that I find intimidating or scary, or if it's something I really like doing, I want to do well. Nervousness is not bad at all. So when you're nervous, glass wall is a quarter of the way down, you see it, you go into your toolbox, you can access both levels, and then you can create the right kind of response. This is where for the person who asked this question specifically, where I think it starts to get a little hairy for you. Nervousness turns into anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean someone lives with anxiety. It's that they're having an anxious response to something. So now that glass wall is down halfway. At the halfway mark, you can still see the toolbox, but you can't directly reach to it. You have to reach underneath the glass wall. When you reach underneath the glass wall, the length of your arms is shorter. So that means you can only actually hit that top level. That means that people they can do basic questions. They can do basic answers. They can kind of remember the basic elements of a script or a presentation that they've had, but they can't get into more of that creative thinking. They can't get into the long-term memory. They can't read the room effectively. If they get stuck or get off base, they get really off. It's because you don't have those lower levels of things. And you also can't read the room, which is a big one for presentations. If anxiety gets more provoked, then anxiety turns into fear. Glass wall comes all the way down. Then you're only left with a response of fight or flight. So in a presentation format, this is when people totally freeze, or they're like, anything to get through this. So based on what I'm hearing here, it's probably like no matter what you do, how much prep and all those things, you still get into that anxious space. So kind of like the stage 2, and you can kind of sort of get through there. Of course, I don't know all the things that you've done. So when I say exposure therapy, what I'd really be encouraging, it's more than just prep. It's more than just like writing down like your ideas and bullet points or this or that. What I'd be doing is I'd be looking to from an exposure therapy point of view, is you've got to socialize yourself to something so much that it doesn't get to anxiety, that it can only get to nervousness. So that means doing stuff like I'm not a huge Toastmasters fan, but doing things like Toastmasters or going more into like things where it's like a presentation training or those things, but not like a presentation training, something you're doing consistently. I would be looking to be presenting ideas frequently. So that would be at work, putting up your hand and being like, give me every single presentation you have, or doing it on your off time. If that's like horrifying, and you're like, that's the worst advice I've ever gotten, don't worry about it. Then you don't have to do that. But what it does mean is on your own, you should be taping yourself constantly. You should have an iPad or on your computer using Zoom or any of those things you can record yourself. You should be constantly doing presentations over and over again. You should be setting up presentations to your family, to your friends, to all sorts of people where you're constantly practicing. It's not about practicing a presentation. And in fact, if anything, I think you should try and do a bunch of different topics and try your hand at a lot of different things, but you should be constantly taping yourself and presenting and then watching that taping. It's the only way that you can socialize yourself to that level of getting comfortable with it so that it goes from being anxiety, where you're only getting part of your toolbox, to full toolbox in nervousness. A really great way of doing this, by the way, is using other people's presentations. So if you go on TED Talk, get a 2-minute clip that you really like in there and get the transcript for that 2 minutes. And then just tape yourself doing that same 2 minutes over and over and over again. So not only there are you getting some like exposure therapy where you're doing it, but you're also learning someone else's style, because what you should be doing is pretending to be them. That will also help expand your speaker skills. So there's some basic strategies, but you can't practice your way out of it by just practicing for a presentation. It's got to be exposure therapy. So by doing that, it means taping yourself and then looking at that tape over and over again. It is literally the worst thing. I've done it myself. It's horrible, but once you get there and you'll never go back.
What qualities do CEOs look for in a leader?
Effective at getting results while also effective at being with people. So I talk a lot about business leadership and people leadership. Most CEOs want people in their organization to have good experiences, and they want to have a good culture, and they want all those things. If you talk to most CEOs, they'll talk about that first, but really what's first for them is getting results. So what they're looking for, if I was to give you a percentage, is they're looking at someone who's like 70% an effective business leader and 30% an effective people leader. And that ratio could be higher. So you could have it like 60-40 or 50-50. Really, CEOs at that level, they are looking for people who are very good at getting results and also are quite good with people. Getting results and being good with people, depending on the industry and where a business is at, they don't always actually go hand in hand. And that's why you can see some very senior level people be great business leaders. Like they know how to get results, but they suck at leading people. It's easy to blame those leaders and be like, oh, that person's a bad person. But really, that might be actually exactly what the CEO wants. And it might actually be exactly what the business needs. But that doesn't mean it's good for the culture or good for the people. So it is some kind of combination of business leadership and people leadership. But what that percentage is would be based on like the CEO, what they value and what the business needs.
How does a CEO manage the stress of corporate demands and decision making?
This is going to be different than work-life balance. So I'm going to talk specifically to health, and it's the legs of the chair. It's going to be diet, exercise, sleep, and social time. So stress is an interesting thing because stress is like a constant in life. And stress, when people are like, oh, stress is so bad, we shouldn't have stress. Yes, and. So yes, stress isn't a great thing, especially long-term stress. And we're remarkably well built. Like the human species is remarkably well built to deal with stress as long as we take care of these 4 things. And also, to be super clear, things get done because of stress. So maybe a controversial opinion where people are like, oh, work shouldn't be stressful. It's like, well, I don't think a lot of work would be getting done if it wasn't stressful. Stress doesn't only mean having like a stressful work environment. Like I just mean life's stressors typically are what cause people to be super focused, try and get bigger things, to innovate, to create. All of those things typically lead to results. Stress in and of itself, how we deal with it, we got to be ultra practical. So stress is a reality, and it's not necessarily even a bad thing. It's about whether or not it is, how big it is, how ongoing it is, and then how we interact with it. So from an interaction point of view, and specifically, this is for all people at work, but I talk to CEOs about this all the time. Diet, exercise, sleep, and social are non-negotiable. You have to have all four of them. Again, think about like the legs of a chair. If a chair has four legs, that means you can sit down. So imagine stress being like you're standing. And not only are you standing, but depending on how stressed you are, you're carrying a ton of weight. So if you're if you're really stressed out, you're holding a lot of weight. If you can sit down, that's a huge help. You're still carrying a ton of weight, but you can sit down and the chair can help you. So if a chair has four legs, you can have a real good sit. And who doesn't like a good sit, right? Like you can really like rest into that. But if a chair has three legs, you can sit in the chair, but it gets a little weird because you have to sort of watch how you're sitting. So it's a little less relaxing and you have to engage a little bit of your core, maybe one of your legs. If a chair has two legs, yes, you can sit in it depending on which legs they are, but now your two legs have to actually become the other two legs. So you got to stabilize it and you have to use your core. You're kind of engaged with it. So it's much less relaxing. But if a chair has one leg, you can't sit in it. You're just going to stand. So that's how I think of how we deal with stress from these legs of the chair. When I think of diet, I'm not telling people to go on a diet. More so, it's that you should always, at any given time, know what 50% of your meals are going to be in a week. And that means that you should typically have those meals on hand. Either you have all of the stuff in your house or you like pack a lunch or any of these things. That just simply means from like the quality of food that you're getting, like, are you getting good food? And again, I'm not asking people to have like, vegan quinoa, like loaf or something like that. I just mean good, healthy food that's going to fuel you effectively. You should have 50% of your meals planned a week. And they don't have to be like gourmet meals. They just have to be good meals. If you want to get really ambitious, and especially if you're going through a super stressful time, you can knock that up to 70 or 80%. You could even have 100% of your meals. But the more your meals are planned out and you know what you're going to have, you're going to be able to keep that leg of the chair. The second is exercise. Again, I'm not asking people to be like, marathon runners or anything, but most people need minimum 30 minutes of exercise 3 times a week. And that is just about keeping your blood flowing, like keeping your mind crisp, having the right balance of things going on with your hormones, all of those things. And that 30 minutes could become an hour. It could become an hour and a half. It's whatever people need. Those 3 times a week could be 7 days a week. It's whatever you need. But from a minimum perspective, it should be 3 times for 30 minutes. And that could be light stretching. It could be a walk. It could be all sorts of things. Walking is like really undervalued. Walking is cardio and it is super, super good for you. So even a 30-minute walk helps, but you have to have that in there. Sleep. Most people need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep, especially if we're talking at CEO level. So we're going to say people are like mid to late career at that point. 7 to 9 hours of sleep. There's like 2% of the population that require less than that. These are called short sleepers. And most people think they're short sleepers, but in reality, you're probably just used to being chronically sleep deprived. So that's not correct. You need to have 7 to 9 hours to have that leg intact. And then finally, social. Most people need about an hour of social time a week, minimum. And that could be 1 hour at a time or one day in the week, or you can split that up. You can be way more social than that. And a very few people need less than that, but you do need established social time each week. That could be a phone call with a friend or with multiple friends. It could be Zoom. It could be in person, any of those things. It could be drinks after work, whatever it is. But what it can't be is texting with people is not social time. Social media is not social time. These are typically things that detach us from the human experience or cause a lot of anxiety. Instead, it's actually like person to person or person to groups of people engagement. So when you've got all 4 legs intact, you can be standing and carrying a ton of weight and then sit down and you're still carrying a lot of weight, but you're able to rest and kind of recuperate. But if you lose one of those legs of the chair, then you're compromised. You lose 2 legs and you're really compromised. You use 3, then there's no way you can stand for a long time with that weight, especially if it's getting heavier and heavier. Most people have one leg that is susceptible to going out when they get stressed. So for example, when I get really, really stressed, the thing that always goes out for me is food. I love candy. I love sweet stuff. I love donuts, pie, all of that. As soon as I get really stressed out, I'm like, I just start eating bad. So that's the first leg that goes out. But most people, myself included, usually have a leg that one has gone out, the other one's kind of weak as well. And so my second is exercise. As soon as I start eating bad, I give myself an excuse to stop exercising as well. Now I only got 2 legs and I'm carrying a lot of weight. So in that situation, it's what we'd refer to as mild burnout. It's really, really important. If you are not just a CEO, but anyone who's managing a ton of stress, the absolute focus on your patterns of self-care and keeping those legs intact. And if a leg goes out, as it often does, that you don't let that leg go out consistently for more than 2 weeks. If it goes out for 2 weeks, up to 2 weeks, that's pretty normal in life. But if you let it go for more than 2 weeks, it's normalizing and it's going to be hard to get that back. So stick with the legs of the chair. And that means you can carry a ton of weight and then sit down as you need.
How do you keep balance between work, life, health, and family?
Understand what the quadrants of life work and then intentionally invest time or reinvest time as needed. So the quadrants of life, like imagine a 4-quadrant grid. Top left is work. Top right is family and friends. Bottom left is spiritual. Bottom right, it's interests, hobbies, and passions. So work, what I mean by work is this is what you do to draw revenue, like how you get paid, basically. Nothing goes in there that isn't work, that isn't revenue generating. Family and friends, it's how people define family and friends for them. Some people have what would be considered more like the traditional idea of a family. So people you're related to, and it could be a partner, it could be kids, it could be your parents, your brothers, sisters, cousins, whatever it is. Other people don't have that. And so they have friends or they have friends that are like family. Some people include pets in this as well. Spiritual, this is however people define it. But what I mean by that specifically, it's that thing that helps you understand that you live in like a giant, beautiful, amazing world. It's a thing that gives you perspective that what you're experiencing in life is just a blip in time in a world that has like a ton of amazing things. So for some people, that's going to be religion. Some people are religious. I'm not a religious person. For other people, it's going to be things that get them engaged with life from a bigger perspective. So for me, I love running. So I like running it along the seawall in Vancouver. And for me, it's a totally spiritual thing. It gets me connected to the idea that I live in a huge city full of tons of people I don't know who are out living all of their own lives. If I have like something that like I'm really stressed or anxious about or worried about, I go for a run. And of course the exercise helps, but that idea that like, I'm not just like this little corner of my world isn't everything. There's everything. Life is full of, there's so much more. Life is full of so much possibility. For me, that's like a real spiritual thing. So spirituality, whatever that means to people, think of that. And then the last one is interests, hobbies, and passions. When I think of interests, I think of things that you're willing to put time and money into, but you don't care if you get better at it. And you're not necessarily interested in being part of the culture that surrounds it. So for example, I love sneakers. I really love like Air Max 1s, Air Max 90s, love Sambas. Like I have a lot, like I love Vans. I just like sneakers. I have a lot of sneakers. So I spend a lot of time and money on it. But I'm not trying to have like the most amazing sneaker collection. I don't have like a $3,000 pair of shoes or anything. And also I'm not a part of sneaker culture. Like that's just not where I spend my time. So I'm not invested in the community around it. So for me, it's just an interest. A hobby is something that you'll put time and money into, but you're actively interested in getting better at it. But you don't necessarily care about being part of the culture that's involved with it. So triathlons, I like triathlons a lot and I spend time and money on it. And I am interested in getting better at it. Like each time I do one, I want to do it better. But I'm not part of triathlon culture. Like I don't really know other people who do triathlons. It's not part of my social circle. And then there's passions. Passions are things you're going to spend time and money on. You're actively trying to get better, and being part of the culture and the community that surrounds it matters to you. So for me, that would be music. I spend a lot of time and money on it. I'm always trying to write better and better songs and be in better and better bands, know more and more about music. And also like being connected to the music scene and like having friends within that world and really knowing what's going on totally matters to me. So all 4 of those things are about the balance of life. And that's like taking the complexity of life and breaking it down into these like 4 simple quadrants, because there's like tons of things you can put in each one of these buckets. So you only have 100% of your time though, 100% of your energy. And most people, when they're professionals, they spend the bulk of their time and energy on work. That's where you're spending the most of your time. And that's not bad. So if you think of the number 100% or the percentage 100 of 100, you're spending probably a huge percentage of a huge chunk of that 100% in work. And that's not bad. That's normal, especially when you're kind of like mid to late career, because you're doing like a huge push at that point. It just means that you know where you're spending your time and energy and that you're making good sense of that remaining time. So let's just say I spend 60% of my energy and time at work. That means I got 40% left. And I split that 40% up across those three other areas. Where I'm splitting up that 40% should be based on where I'm getting the most satisfaction. I'm a family person. I have a wonderful wife and three amazing kids, and my mom lives with us, and I have a sister and my dad and my dogs. I spend the bulk of my 40% with my family, and that leaves just a little bit of time for spiritual and a little bit of time for interests, hobbies, and passions. That's great because I get the greatest return out of my family, and that's the best investment. People need to figure out like that extra time that you have outside of work, where you're going to invest that time. But what that also means is you're going to go through periods of your life where you have to reinvest energy in different places. So as an example, let's say you've got your life balanced out where you've got 60% at work and then 40% is invested in other areas of your life. But let's say you've got a family emergency where that energy that it takes to attend to that has to come from somewhere. So you're going to pull some energy from work. You're going to pull some energy from spiritual. You'll pull some energy from interests, hobbies, and passion and reinvest or invest it in your family. Or let's say you're training for a triathlon. That's going to take more time than I usually spend on it. So I'm going to pull energy from different areas and then I'm going to invest it there. Life doesn't just happen. Like we put energy places based on the need at the time. But what it gets freaky, and when I think about work-life balance, is it's very easy to get stuck. So if like you're in a time of your career or you've gone through a really stressful period in your family, or you're super hyper focused on your passions or something that's spiritual, it can get really easy to get stuck and not realize that you're overinvested in an area and you don't know how to pull that energy back. And that means you're not living a balanced life. One of the things that I think people get a little, they don't pay enough attention to is like they talk a lot about work-life balance, but people get focused on all sorts of things that take them out of balance. So it's not just work-life. People could be spending too much time with their buddies. They could be drinking too much. They could be spending too much time exercising. They could be spending too much time on the internet. Life isn't just work and life balance. It's just life balance. And how you split up your time across those four quadrants you should really consider where you're spending your time, but you should also consider when you claw back time from other places that might have gotten stuck and reinvest it other places. It is an intentional practice. And I don't think people should be like, I'm going to spend more time with my kids and be that general. I think you should really look at the percentage, break it down. This is the percentage of time that I think I'm spending in these areas, and then try and pull percentages from other places, know what that looks like in terms of tasks, and then redeploy that energy somewhere else. It is intentional. It takes us out of vagueness. Work isn't the enemy. I'd say most people need work, like really need work. And that doesn't necessarily just mean your career, but like it's not work versus life. Like work is a part of life. It's about finding that right balance between all of them, where balance isn't 100% is equally divided across those four things. It's that the investment is about what gets you the most returns, where you get the most satisfaction, while knowing most of us have to have most of our energy put in work for large periods of our career.
What strategies do you recommend to create the ideal corporate culture?
Be aspirational with your culture, know what it means, and don't be perfectionistic. So when companies talk to me about their culture, they often talk to me about it in this perfectionistic point of view. Like, now that we've put these words on a piece of paper, that's what we are. When in reality, it's like, that's like kind of saying like, I'm going to go from not running marathons to saying, I'm going to run a marathon the very next day. If you're trying to change your culture, especially if you're like trying to change it from maybe having some challenges, you can't just will it into existence the very next day and imagine it to be perfect. That's perfectionism. And I'll just tell you that like doing that is more often than not how I see people try and do this thing. It's like, we are this. Are you? Or are 10 people in a room saying that they want to be that? And maybe 3 of those 10 people deeply disagree, but aren't saying it because the rest of the people are saying it. Culture is a real interesting thing. I really believe companies should focus on their culture, but they should be totally aspirational for it and factor in that human beings are going to human being. So that means like we actually know what that means. So first of all, from the aspirational space, we should be aspiring towards great things. So your culture should be like, we aspire to be like this. And we know exactly what the behaviors are that support this culture. And then we understand what the skills are that are associated with that. So for example, if we're going to say we aspire to be a culture where everyone has a voice. That's all. That's amazing. I love that. That's fantastic. All right. So what's a behavior around that? Well, a behavior around that is that people are constantly in the facilitator mindset. And the facilitator mindset would be not only are they comfortable speaking, but they're also very, very comfortable with encouraging other people to speak, inviting people to speak. So what's a skill around that? Well, a skill around that is it would be asking really effective questions. It would be having really strong physical and verbal presence, but mostly it's about empathy, being able to read the room, seeing who's silent, kind of having an understanding of why they're silent, and then being able to create the right kind of situation where you can give an opening for them to speak, which they may or may not take up, and that then we don't pester them afterwards. So empathy is an actual skill. People don't think it's a skill, but it's a total skill. So think of that from like a cultural perspective. It's like we aspire to be a culture where everyone has a voice. It is awesome. I love that idea, but it has a lot of elements that you really need to understand what you're shooting for. So again, what are the behaviors involved? And then what are the skills associated? So that's like understand what you're shooting for and make sure you've got like hire the right kind of people. You train those people, like you have like all the things that would support that ongoing. But the other piece of it is when I say aspirational, it's you got to let people be people. So if you aspire towards something, you've got to understand that like there's going to be times where people aren't acting like that. And it could be one person, it could be 10 people. It could be like, we're going through a difficult time financially, or there's a lot of stress and people aren't acting up to the culture. So if you're not being perfectionistic, you're assuming that people are going to go off of that aspirational space. So an easy way to start is say, we aspire to be this at least 70% of the time on average. And then at 30% when we're not like that, we have the awareness and skills to get back to that. We can have the conversations. We can look at ourselves in the mirror and kind of hold ourselves accountable. 70% might sound like, oh, that sucks. Like only 70% of the time. Frankly, like if you're being perfectionistic about something, I got to tell you that number is going to be a lot lower. So if you keep it at 70% and get successful at that, so you know what the behaviors are and the skills, you focus on the training about it, that 70% over time becomes like 72%. It becomes 80%. It becomes 87%. Are you ever going to get to 100%? No, because human beings are human beings and they're going to go through difficult times and wild things are going to happen. But you can get more effective and better at being consistent with living an aspirational culture at a higher percentage if you focus on gradual growth. And that also lets people norm to the culture and have it be like a real organic thing rather than this, we are this perspective.
How do you stay ethical and foster that in your organization?
First, know, are they personal ethics or professional ethics or a combination of both? And also know where the line is between your preference and what the ethics are and how those live. And so what I mean by that is most professions and most industries have like professional ethics that are associated with it. Like therapists are going to have it. Coaches are going to have slightly different ones. Like a banker is going to have different ones than that. Lawyers have different ones. So there's like ethical concerns that are like really based in the business. And those could also just kind of like the rules of engagement, essentially, that are like, some of them are written down and some of them are kind of like from a social contract perspective. But then there are personal ethics as well, like what matters to us. And one doesn't necessarily trump the other. Like I think personal ethics are super, super important, but one has more of like the legality of working within an industry and like the things you have to do to essentially effectively to properly be an ethical participant in whatever industry you're in versus things that matter to you. So first would be like really understanding those two things. And the second is knowing where preference is. What I mean by preference is all sorts of people, myself included, have things that we prefer. And those things that we prefer are usually based on what makes the most sense to us, what we like, what's easy, what takes the less amount of effort from us. And sometimes those can feel like ethics, but they're just what we actually prefer. And the flip side of that is making things authentic. And when I say authentic, it's about identifying things that maybe aren't as comfortable for us or that are more challenging, that are harder to do, but we get used to doing it and we learn those skills and kind of build up those muscles, because there are times where doing the thing that's most comfortable for us, the thing that we prefer, isn't the right thing. And we actually have to be able to execute on something that makes us feel uncomfortable. Maybe it's a little bit painful or difficult for us to do, but we know it's the right thing to do. So identify what your business ethics are, what your personal ethics are, and then whatever shortcuts that your preference might be causing you to want to take that it's very common for people to be like, this is like an ethical thing, when in reality it's like, well, maybe I just kind of want it that way and I'm taking this grander stand. So when it comes down to like industry ethics, I mean, that should be just like clear conversation point of view, where it's like, here are the regulations, here's, some industries are regulated, or here are kind of like the general rules of engagement. Some again are like social contract things where it's like, well, we should never lie to our clients. That doesn't mean people don't lie to clients all the time, right? And then there are things that are personal ethics. It's really understanding like, what are the industry ethics, what are my own ethics, and having those conversations with people at a peer level and a leadership level, candidly, without pointing the finger, because the real key here is not about pointing the finger. If you think we're being dishonest, we don't want to come in and be like, you're a liar, because when we do that, we're putting someone on the defensive. I always encourage people to try and use we language with that kind of stuff. Like we might be positioning ourselves with clients in a way that isn't accurate. That's a great way of saying it. When it comes down to what might just be personal preference, I got to encourage people here. It's like, if you don't like something, it can really feel like it's unethical, but really focus like, is this just something I don't like doing? Here's an example. It's like, sometimes we have to give people feedback, and sometimes that feedback is really, really, really difficult. Most people aren't going to say giving people feedback is unethical, but there's all sorts of times where I see people being like, well, it's unethical for me to go down that line. And I'll be like, why? You're just giving someone feedback and they'll say, well, it just feels this way and that way. And then when you get deeper into it, they're like, I just don't like giving feedback. So I got to encourage you here. Is it just a case of something that you don't like doing, that you need to get good at doing and kind of find your own path? Or is it something you actually think is immoral or unethical? If something's immoral or unethical, you can never get good at doing it because it's immoral and unethical. So you shouldn't do it. But you do, but outside of that, most things in work that feel a little bit daunting or challenging or a little scary, they can feel unethical, and you should really challenge yourself about that. For the other piece, though, you got to stick to your guns. You got to stick to what you believe in. The second piece is, how do you help an organization do that? Not all organizations want to do that. I did work at a place where I felt we were positioning ourselves in the market in like a really dishonest way. Having that conversation with my boss at the time was really tough, because I was like, hey, I don't agree with this. I think the way we're positioning ourselves is promising people something, but that's not actually what we do. And my boss had a different opinion. And basically, no matter how I phrased it, my boss was like, you're telling me that I'm lying to people. And at the core of it, that's actually what I did believe. I was like, yeah, I actually do think that. And I had to have a real reckoning with myself. I'm trying to change an organization that does not want to change. And by the way, was very successful, like super successful, positioning themselves. It was my personal opinion. And they worked in an unregulated industry. So there's not like regulations there. So there's not real ethics there that would hold them in a position. It was more my personal ethics. I was like, I think this is a lie. Like, I don't think this is true. And I ended up not working there anymore because I couldn't change that. So it is the line between what are industry ethics, your ethics, and then also what might be a little bit of preference versus trying to learn something. And it's getting that right kind of combination, having conversations with people and doing it like in a non-threatening, but super clear and direct way. Like, don't beat around the bush. And then also, if the organization doesn't want it, then being prepared to leave, because you can't stay and work in a place that you think is unethical. You just can't do it.
We want to hear from you, our audience. To submit your questions, send us a message, drop us a DM, or comment on our social channels.